Welcome to a realm where reality blurs with the unknown, and every shadow holds a story waiting to be told. If you're drawn to tales that send chills down your spine and keep you up at night, then you found your new favorite haunt. Hit that subscribe button to join our community of thrill seekers and ensure you never miss a single ghostly encounter. Each subscription helps us bring more eerie stories to life, so if you're ready to explore the unknown, stick with us, we're just getting started. Have you ever walked into a room and felt an unexplainable presence, as though someone or something was watching you? Maybe you felt a sudden drop in temperature, or caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of your eye, only to find nothing there. Today, we're delving into a story that brings those unsettling sensations to life, with a tale so chilling it will make you question what truly lies beyond the veil. Story 1: The Haunting of Hillside Lane. On the outskirts of a small, sleepy town, nestled among weeping willows and lush greenery, stood an old house on Hillside Lane. It was a grand, aged structure with weathered shingles and ivy creeping up its stone walls. To most of the townsfolk, the house was a charming relic of a bygone era. But to those who knew its secrets, the house was far from benign. When my Aunt Martha passed away, she left the house to me in her will. As a child, I had always been drawn to the house, though I admired it from a safe distance. Its grand, yet somewhat ominous, presence was hard to ignore. The idea of actually living there filled me with a mixture of excitement and unease. After a lengthy process of settling her estate, I finally moved in. The first few days were spent unpacking and exploring the many rooms, each filled with the echoes of the past. The house was vast, with high ceilings and large windows that allowed sunlight to flood the rooms during the day. But as the sun began to set, the atmosphere shifted. Shadows seemed to stretch and contort, filling the house with a sense of foreboding. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind against the windows, felt charged with an unseen energy. It wasn't long before the house began to reveal its secrets. The first sign was subtle, a faint, rhythmic tapping in the walls that seemed to follow me from room to room. At first, I dismissed it as the house settling. After all, old houses are known to make noises as they adjust to changes in temperature and humidity. But this was different. The tapping was too deliberate, too persistent to be mere coincidence. As the days turned into nights, the sounds grew more pronounced. Each evening, as I lay in bed, I would hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing from the attic above. The first time it happened, I froze, heart pounding, straining to hear more. The footsteps were slow and measured, as if someone or something was deliberately pacing back and forth. I tried to rationalize it, convincing myself that it was just the house reacting to the cool night air. But deep down, I knew better. Curiosity eventually got the better of me. One night, armed with nothing but a flashlight and a fragile sense of courage, I decided to investigate. The narrow staircase leading to the attic was steep and creaky, each step echoing ominously in the silence of the house. The air grew colder as I ascended, and the familiar smell of dust and old wood filled my nostrils. When I reached the top, I paused, listening. The footsteps had stopped. The attic was pitch dark, save for the narrow beam of light from my flashlight, which cut through the thick dust particles swirling in the air. The room was cluttered with boxes and old furniture draped in white sheets, giving the appearance of ghostly figures lurking in the shadows. I swept the beam of light across the room, half expecting to see someone standing in the corner. But there was nothing, just silence. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the only sound I heard was the ragged rhythm of my own breathing. After what felt like an eternity, I turned and descended the stairs, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that clung to me like a second skin. The next night, the footsteps returned, louder and more insistent than before. This time they started earlier, as if whatever was making them was growing bolder. Frustrated and more than a little frightened, I decided to confront whatever or whoever was haunting me. I grabbed the flashlight again and made my way to the attic, determined to get to the bottom of this mystery. But just like the night before, when I reached the attic, the footsteps stopped. The room was silent, empty, as if nothing had happened. I stood there, flashlight in hand, feeling a mix of fear and frustration. I was certain there was something or someone in that attic, but once again, I found nothing. Over the next few nights, the footsteps became a nightly occurrence. I tried to ignore them, telling myself that it was just my imagination, that the house was old and prone to making noises. But the more I tried to dismiss it, the more persistent the sounds became. The footsteps were no longer confined to the attic. They began to echo through the hallways, creeping closer and closer to my bedroom. Then, one night, something changed. I was jolted awake by a loud crash coming from downstairs. Heart racing, I grabbed the flashlight and cautiously made my way down the stairs. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the creak of the wooden steps beneath my feet. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I noticed something that made my blood run cold, a trail of muddy footprints leading from the front door to the staircase. The mud was fresh, still wet and glistening under the dim hallway light. But what was more disturbing was that there were no footprints leading back out. I followed the trail, flashlight in hand, each step heavier than the last. The footprints led up the stairs, stopping at the door to my bedroom. I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. Slowly, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty, just as I had left it. But the footprints, they ended at the foot of my bed. Fear gripped me as I searched the room, checking every corner, every shadow, for any sign of an intruder. But there was nothing. No sign of anyone or anything out of place, except for the trail of muddy footprints that led to my bed and then vanished into thin air. Unable to sleep, I spent the rest of the night in the living room, too afraid to go back upstairs. The next morning, I decided to dig deeper into the history of the house. I needed to know what I was dealing with. I visited the local library and spoke to some of the older residents of the town, hoping to uncover the secrets of Hillside Lane. What I discovered was more unsettling than I could have imagined. Decades ago, the house had been owned by a man named Harold Greaves, a recluse known for his strange behavior and obsession with the occult. According to the town's records, Harold was a man of considerable wealth and influence, but his fascination with the dark arts made him a pariah among the townsfolk. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from the house at all hours of the night, chanting, strange music, and the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. It was rumored that Harold conducted bizarre rituals in the attic, rituals meant to summon spirits or even demons. But these were just rumors, whispered among the townspeople with a mixture of fear and fascination. Then, one stormy night, Harold vanished without a trace. His disappearance was sudden and complete, leaving behind no clues, no explanations. Some believed he had fled the town, while others whispered that he had succeeded in summoning something from beyond and paid the ultimate price. The house changed hands several times after his disappearance, but none of the owners stayed long. They all reported strange occurrences, unexplained noises, cold spots, and the feeling of being watched. Armed with this knowledge, I knew I couldn't ignore the situation any longer. If I was going to live in this house, I needed to confront whatever was haunting it. That night, as the footsteps began again, I made my way to the attic, this time determined to face whatever was waiting for me. The room was colder than usual, the air thick with a sense of impending dread. I sat in the center of the attic, my flashlight clutched in one hand, and waited. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just a few feet away from me. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted, and I felt a presence, a cold, oppressive force that seemed to press down on me from all sides. The beam of my flashlight flickered, then went out, plunging the room into darkness. I was surrounded by an overwhelming silence, broken only by the sound of my own labored breathing. And then, out of the darkness, a figure began to take shape. It was faint. At first, barely more than a shadow, but as I watched, it grew more defined. It was a man tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through me. It was Harold Greaves. He didn't speak, but his presence was enough to send a chill down my spine. I mustered all the courage I could and spoke directly to him, my voice trembling. "What do you want? Why are you here?" The apparition remained silent, but the air around me grew colder, and a series of images flashed before my eyes, dark rituals, desperate incantations, and a final act of madness that bound Harold's spirit to the house. I realized then that he was trapped, unable to leave, tormented by the consequences of his own actions. I knew I had to help him. Over the next few days, I reached out to local paranormal experts and arranged for a medium to visit the house. Together, we performed a ritual to release Harold's spirit, hoping to finally bring him peace. The ritual was intense, the air in the attic charged with a palpable energy as the medium chanted the ancient words. As the final incantation was spoken, Harold's apparition began to fade, his form dissolving into a gentle light that slowly lifted towards the attic window and disappeared into the night. Since that night, the house has been quiet, no more footsteps, no more muddy footprints. Sometimes I think I can still feel Harold's presence, but it's no longer malevolent. It's as if he's finally at peace, and the house on Hillside Lane can finally rest. If you're as captivated by these tales as we are, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. The chilling tale you've just heard is only the beginning. Ghosts don't just haunt houses, they linger in places that hold memories of tragedy, sorrow, and unresolved mysteries. Our next story takes us to a place where the walls have witnessed more than just the passing of time, a once grand hotel that now stands forgotten, yet not entirely empty. Story 2, The Phantom of Crestwood Inn. Nestled deep within a sprawling forest, Crestwood Inn was once a beacon of luxury and elegance. In its heyday, it was the destination for the rich and famous, a place where society's elite would escape the hustle and bustle of city life for a weekend of relaxation in nature's embrace. The inn's grand ballroom hosted countless parties, its dining room served exquisite meals, and its rooms provided unparalleled comfort. But like many old buildings, Crestwood Inn fell victim to the passage of time. As the decades passed, it slowly lost its allure, its guests dwindling until it was eventually abandoned. The inn stood empty for years, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Vines crept up its stone walls, its once immaculate gardens became overgrown, and the forest began to encroach on the grounds. But despite its dilapidated state, Crestwood Inn never lost its eerie charm. Local legends spoke of strange occurrences at the inn, lights flickering on in empty rooms, music playing in the deserted ballroom,
and the sound of footsteps echoing down the hallways long after the last guest had checked out. I first heard about Crestwood Inn from a friend who had an interest in the paranormal. We were sitting around a campfire one night, swapping ghost stories, when he mentioned the inn. "There's something not right about that place," he said, his voice low and serious. "People say it's haunted by the ghost of a woman who died there under mysterious circumstances." Intrigued, I decided to visit the inn the following weekend. I'm not one to shy away from a good ghost story, and the idea of exploring an abandoned hotel with a dark past was too tempting to resist. Early Saturday morning, I packed my camera, flashlight, and a few other essentials and set off for Crestwood Inn. The drive through the forest was long and winding, the road narrowing as I ventured deeper into the woods. As I rounded a bend, the inn came into view, a large, imposing structure that seemed to rise out of the mist like a phantom. The building was still grand in its own way, but there was an air of neglect about it. The windows were dark, many of them broken, and the once vibrant red roof tiles had faded to a dull, rusty hue. I parked my car at the edge of the overgrown driveway and made my way to the front entrance. The heavy wooden doors creaked as I pushed them open, revealing a dimly lit lobby covered in a thick layer of dust. The air was cool and musty, carrying the faint scent of decay. I paused for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness before stepping inside. The interior of the inn was a stark contrast to its once luxurious past. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and the walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges. A grand chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals dulled by years of neglect. As I walked further into the lobby, my footsteps echoed eerily in the silence, the sound amplified by the cavernous space. I made my way to the reception desk, where an old-fashioned bell sat on the counter. Out of curiosity, I gave it a light tap. The sharp ring seemed to reverberate through the entire building, and for a moment, I could have sworn I heard the distant sound of footsteps on the floor above me. But when I listened more closely, the sound had vanished, leaving only the creaking of the old building in its wake. Determined to explore more, I ventured further into the inn. The ballroom was my next stop. Even in its decayed state, it was easy to imagine the grandeur it once held. The tall windows, though grimy, allowed streams of light to filter in, casting long shadows across the dusty dance floor. I walked to the center of the room, looking up at the ornate ceiling, which was adorned with intricate designs that had long since faded. As I stood there, taking in the surroundings, I heard it again, faint music, as if from an old gramophone, playing a slow, haunting waltz. It was barely audible, almost as if it was coming from another room. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest, but as I crossed the threshold into the next room, the music stopped abruptly, leaving me in unnerving silence. I began to wonder if my mind was playing tricks on me, but the stories I'd heard about the inn kept replaying in my head. They said the ghost of a woman haunted the hotel a former guest who never checked out. She was often seen in the ballroom, dancing alone to the music that no longer played. Continuing my exploration, I made my way upstairs to the guest rooms. The staircase groaned under my weight, each step a reminder of the inn's advanced state of decay. The second floor was even darker than the first, with many of the windows boarded up. I walked down the hallway, peering into the rooms as I passed. Most were empty, save for the remnants of old furniture and personal belongings left behind by guests long gone. It was in one of these rooms that I experienced something I will never forget. As I entered the room, I was struck by a sudden drop in temperature. The air became icy cold, and my breath formed clouds in front of me. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me, but the chill seemed to seep into my bones. The room itself was unremarkable: a small bed, a dresser, and a chair by the window. But there was something about the atmosphere that felt oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in on me. I walked over to the window, hoping to get a better look at the view outside, but the glass was so dirty that I could barely see through it. As I turned to leave the room, I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror above the dresser, a shadowy figure standing behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. My heart raced as I looked back at the mirror, but the figure was gone. All that remained was my own reflection, pale and wide-eyed, staring back at me. Shaken, I left the room and continued down the hallway. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something or someone was following me. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind through the broken windows, set my nerves on edge. I decided it was time to leave. I made my way back downstairs, my footsteps echoing loudly in the empty halls. But as I reached the lobby, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps, this time directly above me. They were slow and deliberate, moving across the ceiling towards the staircase. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood frozen, listening to the footsteps descend the stairs. But when I turned to look, there was no one there. I rushed out of the inn, slamming the heavy doors behind me. The forest seemed to close in around the building as I ran to my car, the shadows growing longer as the sun began to set. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that I had disturbed something that was never meant to be disturbed. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about Crestwood Inn. The stories, the sounds, the figure in the mirror, they all haunted my thoughts. I returned to the inn several times, hoping to capture evidence of the paranormal activity, but each time, the inn seemed to grow quieter, as if whatever spirits resided there had retreated into the shadows, unwilling to show themselves again. But one night, as I reviewed the footage I had taken during my visits, I noticed something strange. In one of the videos, as I panned across the ballroom, there was a brief flicker of fleeting image of a woman in a flowing dress, spinning gracefully across the dance floor. It was only there for a moment, barely a second, but it was enough to send chills down my spine. I paused the video, rewinding and playing the clip over and over again. There was no denying it, someone or something was there. A ghostly figure, caught on camera, dancing to the music that no longer played. The ghost of Crestwood Inn had made herself known, if only for a moment. To this day, Crestwood Inn remains a place of mystery and intrigue. Many who visit report strange occurrences, unexplained noises, cold spots, and the feeling of being watched. But those who are brave enough to spend the night often speak of a woman in white, dancing alone in the ballroom, forever searching for a partner who will never return. We've journeyed through haunted houses and eerie inns, but now we venture into the wilderness, a place where ancient trees whisper secrets, and the wind carries the cries of lost souls. This story takes us deep into a forest that has long been shrouded in mystery and fear, a place where those who enter are not always the same when they leave. Story 3: The Curse of Blackwood Forest. Blackwood Forest has always been a place of legend. Spanning hundreds of acres, its dense canopy and thick underbrush make it a formidable place to explore. For generations, the locals have passed down stories of the forest's dark past, tales of disappearances, strange creatures, and an ancient curse that hangs over the land like a dark cloud. Despite the warnings, there are always those who are drawn to its mysterious depths, tempted by the thrill of the unknown. It was late autumn when I first heard about the curse of Blackwood Forest. The trees had shed their leaves, leaving the forest floor covered in a thick blanket of orange and brown. The days were growing shorter, the nights colder, and the air carried the sharp scent of decaying foliage. A friend of mine, a fellow adventurer with a penchant for the paranormal, told me about the forest one night as we sat around a fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on the ground. Blackwood Forest isn't just any forest, he said, his voice low and serious. There's something in those woods, something ancient and evil. People say it's cursed. Those who go in don't always come out, and those who do, they're never the same. Intrigued, I decided to investigate. I've always been fascinated by places with dark histories, and Blackwood Forest sounded like the perfect place to explore. Early one Saturday morning, I packed my gear camera, flashlight, and a map of the forest and set out for Blackwood. The drive to the forest was uneventful, the road winding through rolling hills and small villages that seemed untouched by time. As I neared the forest, the landscape changed. The trees grew taller, their branches intertwining to form a thick canopy that blocked out the sun. The air grew cooler, and the sky darkened as clouds gathered overhead. When I arrived at the edge of the forest, I parked my car on a small dirt road and stepped out, taking a deep breath of the crisp, cool air. The forest loomed before me, a wall of dark green that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I could feel the weight of the place, as if the very earth beneath my feet was trying to warn me of what lay ahead. But I was determined to see it for myself. I checked my map and headed into the forest, following a narrow trail that wound its way through the trees. The path was overgrown in places, and I had to push my way through the thick underbrush. The sounds of the forest were all around me, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. But as I ventured deeper into the woods, the sounds began to change. The birdsong grew fainter, and the rustling leaves seemed to whisper secrets just out of reach. After about an hour of walking, I came across a clearing. It was a small circular space surrounded by ancient trees whose twisted branches reached out like gnarled fingers. In the center of the clearing stood a large stone, half buried in the earth. The stone was covered in strange symbols, carved deep into its surface. I had never seen anything like it before. I approached the stone, intrigued by the markings. They were unlike any writing I had ever encountered, jagged lines and spirals that seemed to form a pattern, though one I couldn't decipher. I reached out to touch the stone, and as soon as my fingers made contact, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The air around me grew colder, and the sky darkened as a thick fog began to roll in from the trees. I stepped back, feeling a sudden sense of unease. The clearing, which had felt almost peaceful just moments before, now seemed menacing. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches creaking as they swayed in the wind. I felt as though I was being watched, and the feeling of unease grew into a palpable fear. I quickly took a few photos of the stone and the clearing before turning back to the trail. But as I walked, the fog grew thicker, obscuring the path ahead. The once familiar trail now seemed foreign, and I began to feel disoriented. I pulled out my map, but the fog made it difficult to see, and I realized with a growing sense of dread that I was lost. I wandered for what felt like hours, the fog pressing in on all sides. The forest, once alive with sound, was now eerily silent, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. My flashlight barely cut through the thick mist, and every step seemed to echo in the stillness. Just when I thought I might never find my way out, I stumbled upon an old cabin nestled among the trees. The wood was weathered and gray, the windows dark and empty. It looked as though it had been abandoned for years. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to approach, but with the fog growing thicker and the darkness closing in, I decided it was my best option for shelter. I pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The air was stale, filled with the scent of dust and decay. The cabin was small, with a single room that held a few pieces of broken furniture and an old stone fireplace. I made my way to the fireplace, hoping to find something I could use to start a fire, but the hearth was cold and empty. As I searched the room, I noticed something strange symbols, similar to those on the stone in the clearing, carved into the wooden walls of the cabin. They were everywhere on the doorframe, the floorboards, even the ceiling. It was as if the entire cabin was covered in these strange markings, each one more intricate than the last. I felt a growing sense of unease as I realized that the symbols formed a pattern, one that seemed to lead to the center of the room. I followed the pattern, my heart pounding in my chest, until I reached the middle of the floor. There, beneath a loose floorboard, I found a small, dusty box. I hesitated for a moment before prying the floorboard loose and pulling out the box. It was old, the wood worn and splintered, with a rusted metal latch holding it shut. My hands trembled as I opened the box, revealing its contents: a small, leather-bound journal and a handful of strange, dark stones. I picked up the journal, flipping through the yellowed pages. The writing was faded, but I could still make out the words. It was a diary, written by someone who had lived in the cabin years ago. As I read, a chilling story began to unfold. The journal belonged to a man named Elias, a hermit who had chosen to live in the forest to escape the chaos of the outside world. But his solitude was soon disturbed by strange occurrences, eerie noises in the night, strange lights in the woods, and the feeling of being watched. Elias wrote of the stone in the clearing, how he had discovered it one day and how it had seemed to change him. He became obsessed with the symbols, spending hours carving them into the walls of his cabin, convinced that they held the key to understanding the forest's mysteries. But as his obsession grew, so did the darkness around him. He wrote of seeing shadows moving among the trees, of hearing voices calling to him from the depths of the forest. The final entry in the journal was barely legible, scrawled in a frantic hand. Elias wrote of a presence in the woods, an ancient, malevolent force that had cursed the land. He believed the stone in the clearing was a marker, a warning to those who dared to enter the forest. And now, he was certain that the curse had found him. The journal ended abruptly, the final pages torn out. I sat in the dim light of the cabin, the journal clutched in my hands, feeling a deep sense of dread. The fog outside had thickened, pressing against the windows like a living thing. I knew I had to leave, but the thought of stepping back into the forest filled me with fear. I decided to stay in the cabin for the night, hoping the fog would lift by morning. I made a makeshift bed out of old blankets and lay down, the journal still clutched in my hands, but sleep did not come easily. The cabin was deathly quiet, the only sound the occasional creak of the wooden beams. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the weight of the forest pressing in around me, as if it was trying to seep into the cabin and claim me. Sometime during the night, I was awoken by a loud noise, a deep, resonant thud that seemed to shake the very walls of the cabin. I sat up, heart racing, and listened. The noise came again, louder this time, as if something was moving outside. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight, and crept towards the door. The air was thick with fog, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. I shone the flashlight into the mist, my hand shaking, but saw nothing. The forest was silent, the only sound my own labored breathing. Suddenly, a shape emerged from the fog, a dark, shadowy figure, moving slowly towards the cabin. I froze, fear, paralyzing me as the figure drew closer. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, and its eyes, if it had any, were hidden in the darkness. The figure stopped a few feet from the cabin, and for a moment we stood in silence, staring at each other. Then, without warning, the figure turned and disappeared back into the fog, its form melting into the mist as if it had never been there. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, too scared to move, before finally forcing myself to step back inside the cabin and bolt the door behind me. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was out there in the fog, waiting. But as dawn broke and the first rays of sunlight pierced through the mist, the fear began to fade, replaced by a sense of urgency. I knew I had to leave the forest before the curse claimed me as it had claimed Elias. I gathered my things and stepped outside, the fog still lingering but slowly dissipating in the morning light. I made my way back to the trail, retracing my steps as quickly as I could. The forest was still and quiet, as if the events of the night before had been nothing but a bad dream. But as I reached the edge of the woods and the safety of my car, I knew that what I had experienced was real. I never returned to Blackwood Forest. The curse, the shadows, and the figure in the fog, they were all too real, and I knew better than to tempt fate a second time. The forest remains a place of mystery and danger, its secrets hidden in the shadows of the ancient trees. And while the curse may be dormant for now, I have no doubt that it still lingers, waiting for the next unwary soul to venture into its depths. We've walked through haunted houses and forests cursed by ancient forces, but sometimes the most terrifying places are hidden underground, where the weight of the earth presses down and the darkness is absolute. Our next story takes us deep beneath the surface, into an abandoned mine where echoes of the past still linger, and the spirits of those who perished long ago are far from at rest. Story 4. The Voices from Below. The town of Granite Hollow was built on the back of its mining industry. For decades, miners toiled away in the depths of the earth, extracting precious minerals that brought wealth and prosperity to the town. But the wealth came at a cost. Over the years, the mines claimed many lives, accidents, cave-ins, and unexplained disappearances that became the stuff of local legend. Eventually, the mines were closed, and Granite Hollow became a quiet, forgotten town, its heyday long past. The old mines, however, were never truly abandoned. Local folklore spoke of strange happenings in the tunnel's phantom lights, disembodied voices, and the sound of pickaxes striking rock, even though the mines had been deserted for years. Some said the spirits of the miners who had died there still lingered, unable to rest, their souls trapped in the darkness below. I first heard about the mines from a local historian I met while passing through Granite Hollow on a road trip. We were sitting in a small, dusty cafe, the kind of place where the scent of old coffee and worn leather mingled with the faint aroma of pie baking in the kitchen. The historian was an older man, with weathered skin and a glint in his eye that spoke of a lifetime spent uncovering secrets. When I mentioned my interest in ghost stories and local legends, his face lit up. "You want a real ghost story?" he asked, leaning in conspiratorially. "Then you need to visit the old Granite Hollow mine. But be warned, it's not for the faint of heart. Many have gone down there, but not all have come back." Intrigued, I asked him to tell me more. He spoke of the mine's dark history, the accidents, the cave-ins, and the men who were buried alive beneath tons of rock. He told me of the strange occurrences reported by those brave enough or foolish enough to venture into the tunnels after they were closed. But what really caught my attention were the voices. People say that if you stand at the entrance of the mine at night, you can hear them, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The voices of the dead miners calling out from the darkness, warning you to stay away. Some even say they've heard the voices of the ones who were lost men who went into the mine and never came out. The story intrigued me, and I knew I had to see the mine for myself. The historian gave me directions to the entrance, warning me once again of the dangers. But I was determined. That night, after the sun had set and the town had settled into a quiet stillness, I made my way to the old Granite Hollow mine. The entrance to the mine was hidden deep within the forest, a gaping black hole in the side of a hill, half obscured by overgrown vegetation. The air grew colder as I approached, the ground beneath my feet turning from soft earth to hard, packed dirt. I could feel the weight of the mine pressing down from below, as if the very earth was warning me to turn back. I stood at the entrance for a moment, listening. At first, all I could hear was the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional call of a night bird. But as I stood there, the sounds of the night seemed to fade away, replaced by a deep, unnatural silence. It was the kind of silence that made your skin crawl, the kind that felt like a void waiting to be filled. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I almost thought I had imagined it. I strained to hear more, and the whisper came again, clearer this time. It was a voice, distant and echoing, as if it was coming from deep within the mine. "Stay away," the voice whispered, its tone pleading. "Turn back, while you still can." A chill ran down my spine, but I was too intrigued to leave. I pulled out my flashlight and stepped into the mine, the beam cutting through the thick darkness. The walls of the tunnel were rough and uneven, the ceiling low enough that I had to duck in places. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, and the ground beneath my feet was littered with rocks and debris. I walked slowly, the light from my flashlight bouncing off the walls, casting long, shifting shadows. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning as it burrowed deeper into the earth. And with every step, the air grew colder, the darkness more oppressive. As I ventured deeper into the mine, the whispers grew louder. They were all around me now, echoing off the walls, as if the very rock was speaking to me. The voices overlapped, a cacophony of desperate pleas and warnings, but I couldn't make out any individual words. It was as if the mine itself was alive, filled with the trapped souls of those who had died within its depths. Suddenly, the tunnel opened up into a large chamber. The walls here were smoother, as if they had been worn down by years of use. Old mining equipment lay scattered across the floor, rusted carts, broken tools, and piles of rubble. The air was freezing, and my breath came out in visible puffs of steam. I shone my flashlight around the chamber, taking in the scene. The whispers had grown fainter, but they were still there, just at the edge of hearing. I walked further into the room, my footsteps echoing off the walls, when something caught my eye, a shadow, moving at the far end of the chamber. I froze, the beam of my flashlight steadying as I focused on the shadow. It was faint, barely more than a flicker, but it was there. I watched as it seemed to shift and waver, like smoke in the wind, and then, slowly, it began to take shape, a human shape. The figure was tall and thin, its body gaunt and twisted. It stood at the edge of the chamber, half hidden in the shadows, its face obscured. But I could see its eyes hollow, empty sockets that seemed to stare straight through me. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, cold and malevolent, filling the room. My heart raced as I took a step back, the beam of my flashlight trembling. The figure didn't follow, but I could hear the whispers growing louder, more urgent. They filled the chamber, echoing off the walls, a chorus of voices all saying the same thing: leave. Leave now. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing in the tunnel as I fled back the way I had come. The voices followed me, growing louder with every step, until they were all I could hear, a deafening roar of desperation and fear. I burst out of the tunnel and into the cool night air, my heart pounding in my chest. The voices stopped abruptly, as if cut off by an invisible barrier. The silence of the forest was almost overwhelming in its contrast, and for a moment I just stood there, gasping for breath, trying to calm my racing heart. It was then that I noticed the ground at the entrance to the mine. There, in the soft dirt, were footprints, fresh, deep footprints leading into the mine, but there were no footprints leading out. I stared at the prints for a moment, my mind racing. Had someone else been in the mine with me, or had those prints been made by something else? The thought sent a shiver down my spine, and I quickly turned and made my way back to my car, eager to leave the mine and whatever was inside it far behind. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the mine. The voices, the figure, the footprints, none of it made sense. I did some research, trying to find more information about the mine and the men who had died there, but the records were sparse. It was as if the town had tried to forget the mine, to bury its dark history, along with the bodies of the miners who had perished within its depths. But I couldn't forget. The experience haunted me, the whispers echoing in my mind long after I had left the mine behind. I knew I would never go back, but part of me wanted answers, needed to understand what I had encountered in those dark tunnels. I reached out to the historian who had told me about the mine, hoping he could shed some light on what I had experienced. When I told him my story, he listened intently, his expression grave. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "You're not the first to hear the voices," he said, his voice low, "and you won't be the last. The mine, it's cursed. The men who died there, their souls are trapped, unable to move on. They're trying to warn us, to keep us away from the place that claimed their lives. But not everyone listens. Some go back, and they're never seen again." His words sent a chill down my spine, but they also brought a sense of closure. The mine was a place of darkness, a place where the past refused to stay buried. The voices of the dead would continue to echo in the tunnels, warning those who dared to enter. And as long as those voices remained, the mine would never be truly abandoned. If this story gave you chills, let us know by liking the video and leaving a comment. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on the next terrifying tale. Your support helps us continue exploring the most haunted places on Earth. Our journey has taken us through haunted houses, cursed forests, and eerie mines, but now we step into the grand, yet malevolent, halls of a cursed manor. Once a symbol of wealth and power, this old manor has become a place where time stands still, and the sins of the past linger in every shadow. This is a tale of a family curse, where each generation falls victim to the malevolent forces that inhabit their ancestral home. Story 5: The Curse of Greystone Manor. Greystone Manor had been in the Blackwood family for generations. Situated on the outskirts of a small town, the manor was a sprawling estate with towering stone walls, grand staircases, and opulent rooms filled with antique furniture and priceless heirlooms. But despite its grandeur, there was something undeniably sinister, about the place an air of darkness that seemed to seep from the very walls. The Blackwood family had always been shrouded in mystery. Over the years, rumors of strange occurrences and tragic deaths had plagued the family. Each generation seemed to be marked by misfortune, unexpected deaths, accidents, and madness that claimed the lives of many who lived in the manor. Locals whispered of a curse, one that had been cast on the family long ago and had doomed every generation since. I first heard about Greystone Manor from an old friend, an antiques dealer who had recently acquired some items from the estate. We were having coffee one afternoon when he mentioned the manor and the strange history surrounding it. My interest was piqued, and I asked him to tell me more. Greystone Manor is not just any old house, he said, leaning in as if to share a secret. There's something evil about that place. The Blackwood family was cursed, or so the story goes. The curse was supposed to destroy them, to erase them from existence. And from what I've seen, it's done a damn good job. Intrigued, I decided to investigate the manor myself. My friend warned me against it, but I was too curious to be deterred. I had always been fascinated by stories of cursed places, and Greystone Manor seemed like the perfect place to explore. With his help, I arranged a visit to the estate, eager to uncover the secrets that lay hidden within its walls. I arrived at Greystone Manor on a cloudy afternoon. The sky was a dull gray, casting a pall over the landscape that only added to the manor's foreboding atmosphere. The house loomed ahead, its stone walls dark and weathered, ivy creeping up the sides like the fingers of some unseen force trying to pull it down. As I approached the front door, I felt a strange sense of unease, as if the house itself was watching me. The air was heavy, and the silence was almost oppressive. I hesitated for a moment before pushing open the large wooden door, which groaned on its hinges as if reluctant to let me in. The inside of the manor was even more imposing than the outside. The entrance hall was vast, with high ceilings and a grand staircase that spiraled up to the second floor. The walls were lined with portraits of the Blackwood ancestors, their eyes following me as I walked through the hall. There was a chill in the air, despite the fact that it was summer, and a faint smell of dust and decay lingered in the air. I wandered through the rooms, each one more grandiose than the last. The furniture was old and ornate, covered in dust and cobwebs. The windows were draped in heavy curtains, blocking out most of the light, and the floors creaked underfoot. Despite the opulence, there was a sense of neglect, as if the house had been abandoned long ago and was slowly falling into ruin. As I explored, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept hearing faint noises, footsteps, whispers, and the sound of something moving just out of sight. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just the house settling, but the noises persisted, growing louder and more frequent. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, I found a journal lying on a dusty dresser. The cover was worn, and the pages yellowed with age. Curious, I picked it up and began to read. The journal belonged to one of the last Blackwood heirs, a man named William. His entries were disjointed and frantic, filled with ramblings about the curse that plagued his family. He wrote of strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, shadows that seemed to follow him, and whispers that echoed through the halls at night. He spoke of the family curse, how it had claimed his ancestors one by one, driving them to madness or death. He believed that the curse was tied to the manor itself, that it was the house that harbored the evil that destroyed his family. The final entry in the journal was written in a shaky hand, the ink smudged as if he had been in a hurry. William wrote that he had discovered the source of the curse, a hidden room in the manor's basement, sealed off and forgotten for generations. He believed that the room held the key to ending the curse, but he was too afraid to confront whatever lay inside. My heart raced as I read the entry. A hidden room? I had to find it. I quickly made my way down to the basement, the journal clutched in my hand. The basement was cold and damp, the stone walls slick with moisture. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, and the darkness seemed to press in on me from all sides. I searched the walls, running my hands along the rough stone until I found what I was looking for: a small, concealed door, almost invisible in the dim light. It was locked, but the lock was old and rusted, and it didn't take much effort to break it. I pushed the door open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. I hesitated for a moment before descending the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The staircase ended in a small, low-ceilinged room, barely big enough to stand in. The walls were lined with strange symbols, carved deep into the stone, and in the center of the room stood an altar covered in dust and cobwebs. On the altar lay a large, leather-bound book, its cover adorned with the same symbols that were carved into the walls. The book was old, the pages yellowed and brittle. I opened it carefully, the leather creaking as I did so. The pages were filled with strange, arcane writing spells, incantations, and rituals that I couldn't begin to understand. As I flipped through the pages, I felt a sudden rush of cold air, as if the very room was exhaling. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift, growing darker, more oppressive. I heard a low, guttural whisper, a voice that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Leave. Now. I froze, the book slipping from my hands and landing with a dull thud on the stone floor. The voice grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the air around me growing thick with a malevolent presence. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing in from all sides. Without thinking, I turned and ran up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice followed me, echoing through the narrow passage, urging me to leave. I didn't stop until I was back in the entrance hall, the door to the basement slamming shut behind me with a deafening bang. I stood there, gasping for breath, my hands trembling. The house was silent again, but the air was thick with an unseen force, as if the very walls were watching me. I knew I had to leave, but as I turned to go, I heard a low, rhythmic thumping sound coming from upstairs, like the beating of a drum. My curiosity got the better of me, and I made my way up the grand staircase, the sound growing louder with each step. It seemed to be coming from one of the bedrooms, the door at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and as I approached, the thumping grew louder, more frantic. I pushed the door open, revealing a large bedroom filled with antique furniture. The room was dark, the only light coming from the flickering flames of a fire that burned in the fireplace. The thumping sound was deafening now, reverberating through the room, but I couldn't see the source. I stepped into the room, my eyes scanning the shadows. That's when I saw a large wooden chest at the foot of the bed, the lid slightly open. The thumping was coming from inside the chest, the sound growing louder, more desperate with each passing moment. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct told me to leave, to get out of the house while I still could. But I was too far gone now, too consumed by the need to know what was inside. I approached the chest slowly, the thumping now almost frantic. With trembling hands, I reached out and lifted the lid. The noise stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The chest was empty, save for a single, folded piece of parchment lying at the bottom. I picked up the parchment, my hands shaking as I unfolded it. The writing was faded, barely legible, but I could make out the words a final warning, written by William Blackwood before he succumbed to the curse. The curse cannot be broken. The evil that dwells in this house is eternal. To those who find this, I beg you leave this place and never return. The house will claim you as it has claimed us all. A cold dread settled over me as I read the words. The curse was real, and it was more powerful than I could have imagined. I knew then that I had to leave, that I had to escape before the house claimed me too. I dropped the parchment and fled the room, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The house seemed to come alive around me, the walls creaking and groaning as if the very structure was shifting. I raced down the stairs and out the front door, not stopping until I was safely outside. As I stood there, gasping for breath, I looked back at the manor. The house was silent once more, the windows dark and empty. But I knew that the evil that dwelled within was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next victim to claim. I never returned to Greystone Manor. The house remains abandoned, its dark history hidden behind its grand facade. The curse of the Blackwood family lives on, and the evil that dwells within those walls will continue to claim those who dare to enter. As we journey further into the unknown, we find ourselves drawn to the chilling depths of an ancient underground labyrinth, a place forgotten by time, where the very walls seem to hum with the voices of the past. This story will take you deep into the bowels of the earth, where the boundaries between the living and the dead blur, and where every step could be your last. Story 6: The Whispers Beneath the City. Beneath the bustling streets of an old European city lies a network of catacombs that stretch for miles, tunnels carved out of limestone hundreds of years ago to bury the dead. These underground passages are a dark and labyrinthine world unto themselves, a place where the dead outnumber the living and where history whispers from the shadows. The catacombs are a tourist attraction by day, but by night they become something far more sinister, a place where the past refuses to stay buried. I had always been fascinated by the catacombs, their history, and the mysteries they held. So when I was invited to join a group of urban explorers on a midnight expedition into the less traveled parts of the catacombs, I jumped at the chance. The group had discovered an entrance that was not on any official map, a hidden doorway that led to sections of the catacombs long forgotten by the modern world. We met just before midnight, gathering our gear, headlamps, ropes, and maps before heading to the entrance. The streets above were quiet, the city's nightlife winding down, but beneath the surface, a different world awaited us. The entrance was hidden in an alleyway, a small, unmarked door that blended seamlessly into the stone wall. It was easy to miss unless you knew exactly where to look. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. The air grew cooler as we made our way down, the sound of the city fading until all we could hear was the echo of our footsteps. The walls of the staircase were rough and damp, the smell of earth and mildew growing stronger with each step. As we reached the bottom, we switched on our headlamps, the beams cutting through the darkness to reveal a tunnel stretching out before us. The catacombs were just as I had imagined, dark, cold, and eerily silent. The walls were lined with the bones of the dead, stacked neatly in macabre patterns that seemed to go on forever. Skulls stared back at us from the shadows, their empty eye sockets a stark reminder of the countless lives that had ended here. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and every breath felt heavy, laden with the weight of centuries. Our leader, a seasoned explorer named Vincent, led the way, his voice low as he explained the history of the catacombs. These tunnels were created in the 18th century, he said, his voice echoing off the walls. They were used to house the remains of those who could no longer be buried in the city's overflowing cemeteries. Over 6 million people are interred here. As we ventured deeper into the catacombs, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The tunnels twisted and turned, branching off into smaller passages that seemed to lead nowhere. It was easy to get lost down here, and Vincent reminded us to stay close together. The last thing we wanted was to get separated in this maze of bones and darkness. After about an hour of walking, we reached a part of the catacombs that was clearly not on any official map. The walls were rougher, the bones more haphazardly arranged. It was clear that few, if any, had ventured this far in decades, if not centuries. The air here was colder, and the silence was almost deafening. We stopped to take a break, switching off our headlamps to conserve battery. The darkness was absolute, a heavy, impenetrable blackness that seemed to swallow us whole. As we sat in the darkness, I began to hear it, a faint whispering, so soft it was almost inaudible. I strained to hear more, but the sound was elusive, like the wind blowing through the trees on a still night. I mentioned it to Vincent, who nodded grimly. "You're not the first to hear them," he said. "Many who come down here report hearing voices, whispers in the dark. Some say it's just the echo of our own voices, bouncing off the walls. Others believe it's something else, not of this world." We switched our headlamps back on and continued our journey, but the whispers stayed with me, growing louder with each step. They seemed to come from all around us, echoing off the walls, as if the very bones were speaking to us. The others heard them too. I could see it in their faces, the way their eyes darted nervously around the tunnels, the way their steps grew quicker, more urgent. As we ventured further into the catacombs, the tunnels grew narrower, the walls closing in until we had to crouch to continue. The air was thick and musty, the smell of decay overwhelming. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the air with a sense of dread. It was as if the catacombs themselves were alive, the voices of the dead rising up to greet us. We finally reached a large chamber, the walls lined with ancient carvings that told the story of the catacombs' creation. The chamber was massive, the ceiling lost in the darkness above. The bones here were older, more fragile, their arrangement more chaotic. It was clear that this part of the catacombs had been forgotten long ago, left to decay in the darkness. As we explored the chamber, I noticed something strange, a section of the wall that seemed different from the rest. The bones were arranged in a strange pattern, almost like a door. I called Vincent over, and together we examined the wall. There was something behind it, a faint, rhythmic thumping sound, like the beating of a distant drum. Without hesitation, Vincent began to remove the bones, carefully stacking them to the side. Behind them, we found a hidden door, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. The door was old, the wood rotting, but it still held strong. Vincent pushed it open, revealing a narrow passage that led even deeper into the earth. The passage was different from the tunnels we had just walked through. The walls were rougher, the air colder. The whispers were louder here, more distinct. I could almost make out words now, though they were still too faint to understand. We followed the passage, our footsteps echoing off the walls. The further we went, the colder it became until our breath was visible in the air. The whispers were constant now, a low murmur that seemed to come from all around us. I could feel the weight of the earth pressing down from above, the darkness closing in, as if the very walls were trying to swallow us whole. At the end of the passage, we found another chamber, smaller than the last but just as eerie. The walls were lined with more carvings, but these were different, darker, more sinister. They depicted strange, shadowy figures, their faces twisted in anguish, their hands reaching out as if in pain or desperation. In the center of the chamber stood an altar, its surface covered in dust. On the altar lay a single weathered book, its cover adorned with symbols that matched the carvings on the walls. Vincent reached out to touch the book, but as soon as his fingers made contact, the whispers rose to a deafening roar. The walls seemed to close in around us, the air growing thick and suffocating. The shadows in the carvings seemed to move, writhing and twisting, their faces contorting in pain. The ground beneath us began to tremble, and I could feel a cold, malevolent presence filling the chamber. "We need to leave," Vincent said, his voice strained. He grabbed the book and turned to leave, but as he did, the door behind us slammed shut, trapping us inside. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the very walls were alive with the voices of the dead. I could feel the presence growing stronger, the air growing colder. The shadows seemed to move on their own, creeping along the walls, reaching out for us. The ground trembled beneath our feet, and I could feel a deep, resonant thudding, like the heartbeat of some ancient, slumbering beast. Vincent tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The walls seemed to press in on us, the darkness growing thicker, more oppressive. I could feel the presence all around us, a cold, malevolent force that seemed to feed off our fear. And then, as suddenly as it began, the trembling stopped. The whispers fell silent, leaving us in a heavy, oppressive silence. The door swung open on its own, and without a word, we fled the chamber, the book still clutched in Vincent's hands. We didn't stop running until we were out of the catacombs, the cold night air hitting us like a wave of relief. We collapsed on the ground outside, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding in our chests. The city above was quiet, the streets deserted, but below, in the darkness of the catacombs, the whispers still echoed in my mind. In the days that followed, Vincent tried to decipher the book, but the language was unlike anything he had ever seen. He contacted experts in ancient languages, but none could make sense of it. The symbols in the book matched those in the carvings, but their meaning remained a mystery. The experience haunted us both. The whispers, the shadows. A trembling earth it was, as if the catacombs themselves were alive. A malevolent force that had awakened after centuries of silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had disturbed something ancient, something that should have been left alone. Vincent eventually put the book in storage, too unnerved to continue his research. But the catacombs remain, a dark and foreboding world beneath the city, where the voices of the dead still whisper in the darkness, waiting for those who dare to venture too deep. If this story of the underground sent chills down your spine, be sure to like the video, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue exploring the darkest, most mysterious corners of the world. There are more tales to come, so stay tuned, you won't want to miss what's next. From the underground catacombs to the eerie silence of a forgotten graveyard, our next story takes us to a place where the dead rest, but not all peacefully. Cemeteries often evoke a sense of tranquility, but beneath their still surface lies a world of haunting memories and spirits that refuse to be forgotten. In this tale, we delve into the mystery of a ghostly child who roams the cemetery grounds, eternally searching for something or someone lost long ago. Story 7, The Haunting of Evergreen Cemetery. For over a century, Evergreen Cemetery has served as the final resting place for the residents of the surrounding town. Located on the outskirts, It is a vast expanse of weathered tombstones, towering mausoleums, and ancient oaks whose gnarled branches cast twisted shadows over the graves below. The cemetery is meticulously maintained, with its lawns carefully manicured and its pathways clear. Yet there is one section that has been all but forgotten, a secluded area at the very back, where the oldest graves lie, their headstones cracked and crumbling under the weight of time. As a child, I often wandered through Evergreen Cemetery, drawn to its quiet, somber beauty. I found solace in the peaceful atmosphere, a place where I could escape the world and lose myself in thought. But even as a child, I sensed that Evergreen was different from other cemeteries. There was a heaviness in the air, a feeling that something was watching, waiting. And then, there was the story of the ghostly child. The tale of the child who haunted Evergreen Cemetery was one that every child in town knew, passed down from generation to generation. According to the legend, the child was a young boy named Thomas who had died tragically in the late 1800s. His death was shrouded in mystery, but it was said that his mother, unable to cope with the loss, visited his grave every day, driven by grief. One stormy night she vanished without a trace, leaving behind only whispers of madness and despair. Some said she had been taken by grief. Others claimed she had been consumed by the curse of the cemetery itself. But one thing was certain: her spirit, like her sons, never left Evergreen. Over the years, many visitors to Evergreen Cemetery reported seeing a small boy wandering among the graves. His figure was pale and translucent, his eyes wide and searching. He was most often seen in the oldest section of the cemetery, near his grave, sometimes calling out for his mother in a voice that echoed through the night like a faint, mournful wind. The story intrigued and frightened me as a child, and even as I grew older, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Evergreen Cemetery than met the eye. It was a crisp autumn evening when I decided to investigate the story for myself. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cemetery as I made my way through the iron gates. The air was cool and carried the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, the telltale signs of the season's change. As I walked down the winding paths, the sound of my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. The only other sounds the rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant caw of a crow perched high in one of the ancient oaks. The cemetery was eerily quiet, the usual bustle of daytime visitors replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. The shadows lengthened as I made my way to the back of the cemetery, where the oldest graves lay hidden among the overgrown grass and tangled roots. The tombstones here were ancient, their inscriptions worn away by time, their surfaces cracked and crumbling. Some leaned precariously, as if ready to collapse under their own weight, while others had already succumbed to the passage of time, their fragments scattered across the ground. It was here, among the forgotten dead, that I hoped to find the ghostly child. I spent several hours wandering through the old section of the cemetery, my camera in hand, hoping to capture any sign of the paranormal. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky darkened to a deep indigo, the temperature dropped sharply, and a thick fog began to roll in from the trees at the edge of the cemetery. The air grew colder, and the silence deepened, broken only by the distant howl of the wind as it whipped through the tombstones. It was then that I saw him, a small figure standing by a grave, his form barely visible through the thickening mist. He was facing away from me, his head bowed as if in prayer. My heart began to race as I approached, the crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound breaking the silence. I called out to him, my voice trembling slightly, but he didn't move, didn't even acknowledge my presence. As I drew closer, I could see that he was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his short pants and button shirt reminiscent of another era. When I was just a few feet away, the boy slowly turned to face me. His eyes were large and dark, his face pale and expressionless. There was something deeply unsettling about his gaze, something that made my breath catch in my throat and sent a shiver down my spine. He stared at me for a moment, as if trying to decide whether I was friend or foe, before turning back to the grave and continuing his silent vigil. I stood there frozen, unsure of what to do. The boy seemed so real, so solid, yet there was something undeniably ghostly about him, something that made the air around him feel colder, more oppressive. I slowly raised my camera, hoping to capture the moment, but as soon as I did, the boy began to fade, his figure dissolving into the mist like smoke on the wind. Within seconds, he was gone, leaving me alone in the silent graveyard. Shaken, I walked over to the grave where the boy had been standing. The headstone was old and cracked, the inscription barely legible, but I could just make out the name Thomas. This was his grave, the resting place of the boy whose spirit still wandered the cemetery, searching for the mother he had lost so long ago. As I stood there, trying to make sense of what I had just seen, I felt a sudden rush of cold air, as if someone had walked past me. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. The fog had thickened, the shadows deepened, and I knew it was time to leave. As I made my way back to the gates, the sense of being watched was overwhelming, as though the boy's eyes were still on me, following me as I left the cemetery. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the boy and his mother, about the tragedy that had bound their spirits to Evergreen Cemetery. I returned to the cemetery several times, hoping to see the boy again, to perhaps even find some way to help him find peace. But each time, the cemetery was quiet, the fog thick, and the boy was nowhere to be seen. The townspeople, when I told them my story, nodded knowingly. Many had seen the boy, heard his voice calling out in the night. Some claimed to have seen his mother too, her ghostly figure wandering the graves, forever searching for her lost child. The cemetery, they said, was a place where the past and present intertwined, where the dead lingered, unable to move on. The boy's story haunted me. Who was he really? What had happened to him? And why was he still here? I began researching the history of Evergreen Cemetery, hoping to uncover more about the boy and his family. I spent hours in the town's archives, poring over old records and newspapers, trying to piece together the story. I discovered that Thomas had indeed lived in the town, born in the late 1800s to a wealthy family who owned a large estate on the outskirts of town. His father had been a prominent businessman, his mother a socialite known for her beauty and charm. But their lives had been far from perfect. Thomas had been a sickly child, plagued by a mysterious illness that left him weak and frail. Despite their wealth and influence, his parents had been unable to find a cure, and Thomas had died at the age of 8, leaving his mother devastated. After Thomas's death, his mother became obsessed with the idea of bringing him back. She spent hours at his grave, praying, weeping, and conducting strange rituals in an attempt to communicate with his spirit. The townsfolk began to whisper about her, calling her mad, and eventually she was shunned by society. One stormy night, she disappeared without a trace, and her body was never found. Some said she had wandered into the woods and drowned herself in the river. Others claimed she had been taken by the spirits she had so desperately tried to summon. The story sent shivers down my spine. Was it possible that Thomas's mother was still searching for her lost son, her spirit bound to the cemetery just as his was? Or had her grief and madness somehow trapped them both in the world of the living unable to move on. The more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that there was something deeper at play, something dark and powerful that had cursed their souls to wander Evergreen Cemetery for eternity. I decided to return to the cemetery one last time, determined to find some way to help the boy and his mother. It was a cold, moonless night when I arrived, the fog thick and impenetrable as I made my way to the back of the cemetery. The air was heavy, the silence oppressive, as I walked among the graves, searching for any sign of the boy. I called out to him, my voice echoing in the stillness, but there was no response. The cemetery was deathly quiet, the only sound the rustle of leaves in the wind. I was about to give up when I felt a sudden, intense cold that chilled me to the bone. The air grew thick, and the fog swirled around me, and out of the mist, the boy appeared. He was standing by his grave, just as he had been before, his eyes wide and searching. But this time, there was something different about him, something more desperate, more urgent. He looked at me with a pleading expression, his mouth moving as if trying to speak, but no sound came out. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest, and as I did, I saw her a woman standing behind him, her figure faint and ghostly, her eyes filled with sorrow. It was his mother, the woman who had lost everything, now standing before me, her spirit as lost and broken as her son's. The boy reached out to her, his hand trembling, but as he did, she began to fade, her figure dissolving into the mist. The boy's eyes filled with tears, and he let out a silent cry, his voice lost to the wind. I could feel the weight of their grief, their pain, and I knew then that they were trapped, bound to this place by a force stronger than death. I wanted to help them, to find some way to free their souls, but I didn't know how. All I could do was stand there, helpless, as the boy and his mother faded into the fog, their figures disappearing into the night, leaving me alone in the darkness. The experience left me shaken, and I knew I would never forget it. Evergreen Cemetery was a place where the past and present collided, where the dead did not rest, and where the spirits of a mother and her child were doomed to wander forever, searching for the peace that had been denied them in life. We've walked among haunted houses, cursed forests, and cemeteries filled with restless spirits. Now, we journey to a place where the echoes of the past linger on a desolate stretch of road. This road is not just a means of travel, but a boundary between the living and the dead, a place where those who have met tragic ends return to replay their final moments. Join us as we explore the chilling story of a haunted road where apparitions appear without warning, reminding travelers that the past is never truly gone. Story 8: The Ghosts of Willow Creek Road. Willow Creek Road was once a bustling route that connected the old town of Brookhaven to the larger cities beyond. It was a narrow, winding road, flanked by dense woods on either side and bordered by a shallow creek that meandered alongside for miles. In its heyday, the road was busy with travelers' horse-drawn carriages, early automobiles, and pedestrians all making their way along its path. But as the years passed, newer, safer roads were built, and Willow Creek Road was gradually abandoned, left to the encroaching wilderness. The road gained a sinister reputation over the years. Accidents were frequent, especially on the sharp turns that twisted through the dense forest. Many lives were lost on that road, drivers losing control on the slick pavement, carriages overturned, and pedestrians struck by oncoming vehicles. The most infamous of these accidents occurred on a foggy night in 1927, when a school bus carrying 20 children veered off the road and plunged into the creek below. All the passengers perished in the accident, their bodies found scattered along the creek bed the following morning. After the bus accident, locals began to report strange occurrences on Willow Creek Road. Drivers spoke of seeing ghostly figures standing by the roadside, only to vanish as they approached. Some claimed to hear the sounds of children laughing and playing in the distance, even though there was no one there. Others reported seeing a phantom bus, its windows dark, silently gliding along the road before disappearing into the mist. By the time I first heard about Willow Creek Road, it had long been closed to traffic. The road was overgrown with weeds and cracked by the roots of trees that had reclaimed the land. But the stories persisted, passed down through generations, each one more chilling than the last. As someone with a fascination for the paranormal, I knew I had to see the road for myself. It was a chilly evening in late autumn when I made my way to Willow Creek Road. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the treetops as I parked my car at the edge of the old road. The entrance was blocked by a rusted gate, but it was easy enough to climb over. The road beyond was little more than a narrow path, choked with weeds and littered with debris. The air was cool and damp, the smell of decaying leaves and wet earth hanging heavy in the air. I walked slowly, my footsteps crunching on the gravel, the sound echoing in the silence. The road was eerily quiet, the only sound the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The trees on either side of the road were tall and thick, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the fading light. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the shadows grew longer, and a thick fog began to roll in from the creek, obscuring the path ahead. The road twisted and turned, following the natural contours of the land. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The air was thick with tension, and every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me jump. I stopped frequently, listening for any sound that might indicate the presence of something or someone else on the road. I had been walking for about half an hour when I reached the site of the old bridge where the bus accident had occurred. The bridge was long gone, its remains washed away by years of floods and erosion, but the creek still flowed beneath where it once stood. The water was dark and murky, reflecting the gloomy sky above. The trees on either side of the creek were dense, their branches reaching out over the water like skeletal hands. I stood on the edge of the creek, staring down at the water, trying to imagine the horror of that night in 1927. The thought of the children trapped inside the sinking bus, their screams echoing in the darkness, sent a shiver down my spine. I turned away from the creek, intending to continue down the road, when I saw a faint glow in the distance, coming from around the next bend. At first, I thought it was just the setting sun casting its last rays through the trees. But as I watched, the glow grew brighter, taking on an unnatural, bluish hue. My heart began to race as I realized that the light was moving slowly at first, but then picking up speed as it came closer. The fog parted as the light approached, revealing the unmistakable shape of an old bus, its headlights dim and flickering. The bus glided silently down the road, its tires not even touching the ground. Through the cracked windows, I could see dark, shadowy figures sitting in the seats, their faces obscured by the fog. The bus moved slowly, almost as if it were searching for something or someone. As it drew nearer, I felt a cold, clammy hand grip my heart, and I instinctively stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. The bus continued to move toward me, its headlights illuminating the fog in an eerie, ghostly glow. I could see the figures inside more clearly now, children, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes hollow and empty. They stared straight ahead, unseeing, as the bus rolled silently down the road. I wanted to run, to turn and flee back down the path, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. The bus slowed as it approached, and for a moment, I was certain it would stop right in front of me. But just as it reached the spot where I was standing, it veered off the road, disappearing into the fog and trees beyond. The headlights flickered one last time before the bus faded from view, leaving me alone in the thickening darkness. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The fog swirled around me, thick and suffocating, and I knew I had to get out of there. I turned and hurried back the way I had come, my footsteps echoing on the road, the cold air stinging my face. As I made my way back, I heard a faint, distant sound that sent chills down my spine. It was the sound of children's voices, laughing and playing somewhere far off in the woods. The sound was faint, almost drowned out by the wind, but it was there, unmistakable and haunting. I quickened my pace, my heart racing, the sound of the children's laughter growing louder in my ears. I reached the rusted gate and climbed over it, stumbling back to my car. The laughter faded as I slammed the car door shut, the sound of the engine roaring to life a welcome relief from the oppressive silence of the road. I drove away as fast as I could, the trees blurring past in the darkness, the road behind me disappearing into the fog. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the experience from my mind. The bus, the children, the eerie silence of Willow Creek Road, it all haunted me, replaying over and over in my head. I tried to rationalize what I had seen, telling myself that it was just a trick of the light, an overactive imagination fueled by the stories I had heard. But deep down, I knew the truth. What I had witnessed was real, a glimpse into the past, a moment where the veil between the living and the dead had been lifted. I returned to Willow Creek Road once more, driven by a need to understand what had happened that night. I walked the length of the road again, retracing my steps, but this time the fog was gone, the road empty and silent. There were no ghostly lights, no phantom bus, no sounds of children's laughter. It was as if the road had returned to its natural state, the spirits that haunted it retreating back into the shadows. But even though the road was quiet, I could still feel the presence of those who had perished there. The air was thick with their memories, the road itself a living monument to their tragedy. The past, it seemed, was never truly gone. It lingered, waiting for the right moment to resurface, to remind the living of the horrors that had taken place on that lonely stretch of road. Willow Creek Road remains closed to this day, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. The stories of its hauntings continue to circulate, passed down through generations, each telling more chilling than the last. Some say that the spirits of the children still wander the road, searching for a way home, while others believe that the phantom bus will continue its endless journey, forever reliving the moment of its final, tragic ride. As for me, I've never returned to Willow Creek Road. The experience was enough to convince me that some places are best left undisturbed, their secrets buried deep within the earth, where the past can no longer harm the living. But the memory of that night still lingers, a reminder that the dead are never far from us, that they watch and wait in the shadows, waiting for the moment when they can reach out and make their presence known. We've explored haunted houses, cursed forests, and eerie cemeteries, but now, our journey takes us to the open road, a place where you might expect to find freedom, but where darkness can creep up on you when you least expect it. This story unfolds on a desolate stretch of highway that's become infamous for its ghostly apparitions and the mysterious disappearances of those who dared to travel it after dark. Story 8: The Phantom Road of Briar Hollow. Briar Hollow Road was a lonely, winding stretch of highway that cut through miles of dense forest and rolling hills. By day, it was a scenic route, offering travelers picturesque views of the countryside. But by night, Briar Hollow transformed into something altogether different, a place where the shadows seemed to come alive, where the wind howled through the trees like a chorus of lost souls, and where the road itself became a dark and treacherous path to the unknown. For decades, locals had whispered about the strange happenings on Briar Hollow Road. There were stories of phantom hitchhikers who vanished without a trace, of ghostly figures that appeared out of nowhere only to disappear just as suddenly, and of cars that broke down for no apparent reason, leaving their drivers stranded in the middle of nowhere. But the most chilling tales were those of the travelers who had disappeared without a trace, their abandoned vehicles found on the side of the road, the occupants never to be seen again. The legend of Briar Hollow Road was one that I had heard many times growing up, but it wasn't until I was in my early 20s that I experienced its dark power for myself. It was a cold, moonless night when I found myself driving down that fateful road, the headlights of my car cutting through the darkness, the radio playing softly in the background. I was on my way back from visiting a friend in a nearby town, and Briar Hollow was the quickest route home. I had driven the road many times before, but that night, there was something different about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. The road was eerily quiet, the only sound the hum of my engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The trees on either side of the road loomed tall and dark, their branches twisting together to form a tunnel of shadows that seemed to close in around me. As I drove deeper into the forest, the feeling of unease grew stronger, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. It wasn't long before I began to notice the fog. It started as a thin mist swirling around the edges of the road, but it quickly grew thicker until it was a dense, impenetrable blanket that swallowed the beams of my headlights. The visibility dropped to almost nothing, and I had to slow the car to a crawl, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to see the road ahead. Suddenly, out of the fog, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a stop just inches from the figure. My heart was in my throat as I peered through the windshield, trying to make out who or what it was. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in what looked like a long coat that fluttered in the wind. Its face was hidden in the shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. For a moment, neither of us moved, the world around us silent and still. Then, slowly, the figure raised its arm and pointed down the road, its hand trembling as it gestured toward the darkness ahead. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Everything in me screamed to turn the car around, to get as far away from Briar Hollow Road as possible. But something held me there, a strange compulsion that I couldn't explain. I felt as though I was being drawn forward, pulled by an invisible force that I was powerless to resist. The figure continued to point, its hand shaking more violently now, and I could see that it was trying to tell me something, trying to warn me. But before I could react, the figure suddenly vanished, disappearing into the fog as if it had never been there. I was left alone in the car, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The fog pressed in on all sides, the darkness around me thick and suffocating. I knew I should turn back, but the road ahead seemed to call to me, a dark and winding path that led to something unknown, something terrible. With trembling hands, I put the car back into gear and began to drive. The fog was so thick now that I could barely see the road, the trees on either side reduced to vague shapes in the mist. My heart raced as I pressed on, the car creeping forward through the dense, silent night. As I drove, the fog began to clear, just enough for me to see the road ahead. And that's when I saw them more figures standing along the side of the road, their forms barely visible in the dim light. They were lined up in a row, silent and unmoving, their eyes fixed on me as I passed by. There were men, women, even children, their faces pale and expressionless, their clothes old and tattered, as if they had been wandering the road for centuries. I tried to ignore them, to focus on the road ahead, but their presence was overwhelming, filling the car with a cold, oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. The radio, which had been playing softly in the background, suddenly crackled with static, the sound rising to a deafening roar that drowned out everything else. I reached for the dial, trying to turn the radio off, but the static only grew louder, until it was a high-pitched screech that made my ears ring. I could feel the car shaking, the steering wheel vibrating in my hands as the static reached a fever pitch. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped, leaving me in a silence so complete that it was almost suffocating. The figures were gone, the road ahead empty once more. But the feeling of unease remained, a cold, gnawing fear that settled in the pit of my stomach. I knew I was not alone, that something was following me, lurking in the shadows just out of sight. I pressed down on the accelerator, desperate to get off Briar Hollow Road, but the car seemed to move slower and slower, the road stretching out before me like a never-ending nightmare. The fog began to close in again, thicker than before, until I could barely see the road beneath my tires. And then, out of the fog, I saw a curve in the road, sharp and sudden, appearing out of nowhere. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car skidded out of control, the tires screeching as they fought for traction on the slick pavement. I could feel the car sliding, the rear end fishtailing as it spun around in a dizzying spiral. For a moment, everything seemed to move in slow motion. The world outside the windows blurred, the trees and road blending together into a swirling mass of color and light. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, as the car careened off the road and into the ditch. The impact was sudden and jarring, the car slamming into the embankment with a sickening crunch of metal and glass. My head snapped forward, the seatbelt digging into my chest as the airbags deployed with a deafening pop. The world went black for a moment, the force of the crash knocking the wind out of me. When I came to, the car was still, the engine silent. The only sound was the distant rustle of leaves in the wind, the quiet creak of the car settling into the ditch. My head throbbed with pain, and I could feel blood trickling down my forehead from a cut on my scalp. I fumbled with the seatbelt, my hands shaking as I tried to free myself. The door was jammed, the frame bent from the impact, but I managed to push it open with a grunt of effort. I stumbled out of the car, my legs weak and unsteady, and fell to the ground, gasping for air. The fog was thicker than ever, swirling around me in dense, suffocating waves. I could barely see the car behind me, its headlights flickering weakly in the darkness. The road was empty, the figures gone, but I could still feel their presence, lingering in the air like a cold, malevolent force. I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't support me. I collapsed back to the ground, my head spinning as I struggled to stay conscious. The cold was seeping into my bones, numbing my fingers and toes, and I knew I wouldn't last long in the freezing night air. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I saw a faint light in the distance, cutting through the fog like a beacon. It was moving towards me, growing brighter with each passing second. I tried to call out, but my voice was weak, barely more than a whisper. The light drew closer, until I could make out the shape of a car, its headlights piercing the fog as it rolled to a stop beside me. The driver's door opened and a figure stepped out, a tall man with a stern face and sharp eyes. He looked down at me, his expression unreadable, and for a moment I feared he was one of the apparitions from the road. But then he spoke, his voice low and calm, and I realized he was real. "You're lucky I found you," he said, helping me to my feet. "This road isn't safe after dark. You should have known better than to drive it alone." I nodded weakly, too exhausted to argue. He helped me into his car, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders as he drove me back to town. The road was empty, the fog lifting as we left Briar Hollow behind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us, following us through the night. When we reached the town, the man dropped me off at the local hospital, insisting I get checked out before going home. As I sat in the hospital bed, the events of the night replayed in my mind: the fog, the figures, the crash. It all seemed so surreal, like a bad dream that I couldn't wake up from. But the bruises on my body, the cut on my head, the wrecked car, all of it was real. Briar Hollow Road was real, and whatever haunted it was real too. I knew I would never drive that road again, and I warned everyone I knew to stay away from it. Even now, years later, I can still hear the whispers in the fog, the distant wail of the wind through the trees. Briar Hollow Road is a place where the past and present collide, where the living and the dead walk side by side, and where those who dare to travel it after dark may find themselves lost in a nightmare from which they can never escape. If this chilling tale of the haunted road kept you on the edge of your seat, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Share your thoughts or any eerie experiences you've had on dark, lonely roads in the comments below. We've got more ghostly stories and paranormal encounters coming your way, so stay tuned, you won't want to miss what's next. We've explored haunted houses, cursed roads, and ghostly forests, but some of the most terrifying encounters happen in the places we feel safest in our own homes, staring back at us from the mirror. This final story delves into the chilling world of haunted reflections, where something malevolent lurks just beyond the glass, waiting for the moment when you're most vulnerable. Story 10, The Curse of the Mirror. The mirror was an antique, a beautifully crafted piece with an ornate gold frame, intricately carved with delicate floral patterns. It had been in the family for generations, passed down from mother to daughter, each inheriting it as part of their dowry. It was said to have been a wedding gift to my great-great-grandmother, a piece commissioned by a wealthy nobleman in the late 1800s. The mirror was a symbol of beauty and prosperity, but it also held a dark secret, one that had been kept hidden for decades. Growing up, I was always fascinated by the mirror. It hung in my grandmother's bedroom, positioned above the fireplace where it caught the light of the afternoon sun, casting a warm, golden glow across the room. But despite its beauty, there was something unsettling about it, something that made me uneasy whenever I looked into it. The reflection was always just a little too sharp, the colors a little too vibrant, as if the mirror showed the world in a way that was just slightly off. When my grandmother passed away, the mirror was passed down to my mother, who hung it in our living room. I remember the day it arrived, the movers struggling to carry the heavy piece into the house, their breath misting in the cold winter air. My mother was thrilled to have it, seeing it as a cherished family heirloom, a piece of our history. But I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over me every time I looked into it. It started with small things, faint shadows that flickered at the edges of the glass, or the feeling that someone was standing just behind me when I looked into the mirror. I would catch glimpses of movement in the reflection, but when I turned around, the room was empty, At first, I thought it was just my imagination, or perhaps a trick of the light. But as the days went on, the strange occurrences grew more frequent, more unsettling. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I stood in front of the mirror, brushing my hair. The room was quiet, the only sound the soft ticking of the clock on the mantel. I was lost in thought, staring at my reflection without really seeing it, when I noticed something strange. The reflection in the mirror wasn't quite right there, was a shadow behind me, faint but unmistakable, moving slowly across the room. My heart skipped a beat, and I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there. But the room was empty, the door closed, and the shadows cast by the flickering candlelight were still. I turned back to the mirror, my breath catching in my throat as I saw the shadow again, closer now, just behind my right shoulder. It was the shape of a person tall and thin, its features blurred, as if seen through a veil of smoke. I stared at it, frozen in place, my mind racing. The shadow didn't move, didn't react to my presence. It simply stood there, its dark form blending into the background, as if it had always been there, waiting. I wanted to look away, to run out of the room and never look back, but I couldn't. I was transfixed, my eyes locked on the shadowy figure as it slowly raised its hand, reaching out toward me. My breath hitched, and I felt a cold chill run down my spine as the shadow's hand brushed against my shoulder, the touch icy and unnatural. I screamed, stumbling backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The mirror wobbled on its hook, the glass shimmering as if it were liquid. For a moment I thought it might shatter, but it held firm, the reflection returning to normal as the shadow vanished. I stood there, shaking, my eyes wide with fear. I knew then that something was wrong with the mirror, something evil that had been trapped inside it for years. I tried to tell my mother about what I had seen, but she dismissed it as a bad dream, a figment of my imagination. She was so attached to the mirror, so convinced of its value and importance, that she refused to believe anything could be wrong with it. But I knew better. I had seen the shadow, felt its cold touch, and I was certain that it was real. As the weeks went by, the encounters with the shadow grew more frequent, more terrifying. It would appear behind me when I least expected it, its dark form looming in the background as I brushed my teeth, combed my hair, or even just walked past the mirror. Each time, it was closer, more defined, its presence more oppressive. I began to dread being in the same room as the mirror, avoiding it whenever possible. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape it. The shadow was always there, waiting for me, watching me. I started having nightmares, dreams where the shadow would reach out from the mirror and drag me inside, trapping me in a world of darkness and cold, where I would be lost forever. Desperate for answers, I began researching the history of the mirror, digging through old family records and newspaper archives. What I discovered sent chills down my spine. The mirror had a dark past, one that had been kept hidden for generations. The wealthy nobleman who had commissioned the mirror had been obsessed with the occult, conducting strange rituals in an attempt to summon spirits and gain power over the supernatural. He had used the mirror as a portal, a way to communicate with the other side. But something had gone wrong, terribly wrong. A spirit, dark and malevolent, had become trapped in the mirror, unable to escape, and over the years it had grown stronger, feeding on the fear and suffering of those who gazed into its depths. The nobleman's family had suffered greatly mysterious deaths, madness, and disappearances that had plagued them for generations. The mirror was passed down from one family member to the next, each inheriting the curse along with it. My great-great-grandmother had been the last to receive it, and since then, the truth had been buried, forgotten until now. I knew I had to do something before the shadow consumed me, just as it had consumed so many others. But how could I destroy something so ancient, so powerful? I couldn't just smash the mirror who knew what kind of horrors that might unleash. I needed help, and I knew exactly where to find it. I reached out to a local paranormal investigator, a woman who had gained a reputation for dealing with cursed objects in haunted places. When I told her about the mirror, she agreed to come to the house and see it for herself. She arrived the next day, a small, unassuming woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She took one look at the mirror and nodded, as if she had seen this kind of thing many times before. "This mirror is a doorway," she said, her voice calm and steady. "A portal to the other side. The spirit trapped inside has grown strong, feeding on the energy of those who gaze into it. It must be released, but doing so is dangerous. If the ritual isn't performed correctly, the spirit could escape and wreak havoc." She explained the process, a complex ritual that would involve breaking the mirror's connection to the other side and banishing the spirit back to where it came from. It required specific ingredients, symbols, and words that had to be spoken with precision. I was terrified, but I knew it was the only way. That night, we performed the ritual. The investigator drew symbols on the floor around the mirror, lit candles, and burned incense that filled the room with a thick, heady smoke. She chanted in a language I didn't understand, her voice low and rhythmic, the words flowing like a dark, ancient melody. As she chanted, the mirror began to shimmer, the glass rippling like water. The shadow appeared, its dark form twisting and writhing within the confines of the frame. It reached out, its hand pressing against the glass as if trying to break free. The air grew cold, the temperature dropping rapidly as the candles flickered and the symbols on the floor glowed with an eerie light. The investigator's voice grew louder, more insistent, the words echoing off the walls. The mirror vibrated violently, the glass cracking, the shadow thrashing within its confines. I could feel the malevolent energy in the room, thick and oppressive, pressing down on me from all sides. And then, with a final, deafening crack, the mirror shattered, the glass exploding outward in a shower of shards. The shadow screamed, a high-pitched, inhuman wail that echoed through the house before it was sucked back into the void, disappearing into the darkness from which it came. The room fell silent, the air still and heavy. The mirror was gone, nothing left but a broken frame and a scattering of glass on the floor. The investigator let out a long breath, her shoulders slumping in exhaustion. "It's done," she said quietly. "The spirit is gone. The mirror is no longer a threat." I was shaken but relieved. The curse that had haunted my family for generations was finally broken. The shadow was gone, and the house felt lighter, freer, as if a dark cloud had been lifted. I thanked the investigator, paying her for her services and watching as she left, taking the broken mirror with her. Life slowly returned to normal after that. The nightmares stopped, and the sense of dread that had hung over the house for so long disappeared. But I would never forget the shadow in the mirror, the dark presence that had watched me, followed me, and nearly consumed me. The mirror was gone, but its memory remained, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk in even the most beautiful of things.